The year is 1941. The North African sun beats down on the shores of Tripoli, Libya. A new force has arrived, one destined to change the face of the Desert War. This is the vanguard of the Deutsches Afrikakorps, Germany's elite expeditionary force, led by a man who would soon become a legend, Erwin Rommel. As the dust settles and the panzers roll off the transport ships, the German command gets to work. Their first order of business: understand the enemy. In a makeshift command tent, German intelligence officers pore over captured British documents. They are meticulous, confident, and professional. Their eyes scan the order of battle sheets, listing the various formations of the British Eighth Army. They see familiar names: British Guards, regiments, Australian divisions, New Zealanders. These are opponents they respect, soldiers from nations they understand. But then, their fingers trace down the list to a curious entry: colonial units from India. Among them, names like the 4th Indian Division, containing battalions of men called Gurkhas. A dismissive murmur ripples through the tent. The officers, products of a rigid military tradition that prized racial purity and technological supremacy, look at each other with a shared understanding. Gurkhas. Who were they? The prevailing German assessment was blunt and arrogant. These were seen as primitive troops, small men from the remote hills of Nepal, armed with little more than their famous curved knives, the Kukri. They were considered little better than tribal levies, utterly unprepared for the high-speed mechanized blitzkrieg warfare that the Wehrmacht had. How could these jungle folk possibly stand against the might of a modern panzer division? They were a footnote, a curiosity, not a serious threat. The reports sent back to Berlin would reflect this condescending view. The British were desperate, they concluded, forced to rely on ill-equipped and unsophisticated colonial soldiers to bolster their thinning ranks. This was one of the greatest intelligence failures of the Desert War. While German officers were scoffing at their paper assessments, a very different scene was unfolding in the British staging areas. The Gurkha battalions of the British Indian Army were arriving. They were not a rabble. These were professional soldiers, men from a warrior tradition stretching back centuries. They were quiet, disciplined, and exuded a calm confidence that unsettled even their own British officers. They cleaned their rifles with practiced ease and sharpened their kukris with a solemnity that bordered on ritual. They were volunteers, every single one of them, men who had chosen the profession of arms. Their British commanders knew their true worth. They had seen them in action on the rugged northwest frontier of India. They knew that these men possessed a fieldcraft that was second to none. They could move like ghosts in the night, cover ground with astonishing speed and stamina, and in close-quarter combat, they were absolutely terrifying. Their motto, Kafrahunu Banda Marnu Ramro, translates to better to die than be a coward. This wasn't just a slogan. It was a code they lived and died by. As the Gurkhas acclimatized to the harsh desert environment, a world away from their lush Himalayan homeland, they watched the German reconnaissance planes buzz overhead with a patient, knowing gaze. They were underestimated, and they knew it. But they also knew that war is not fought on paper or in the prejudiced minds of intelligence officers. It is fought on the ground, with steel, courage, and blood. The German assumption that these primitive soldiers were unfit for modern warfare was a fatal miscalculation. The Wehrmacht believed they were facing a poorly equipped colonial afterthought. In reality, they were about to come face to face with one of the most formidable and feared infantry forces in the world. The desert held its breath. A shadow was falling across the sand, but it was not the one the Germans expected. The Gurkhas were here, and the legend of their ferocity was about to be written in the annals of the Second World War. The Wehrmacht's education was about to begin, and the tuition would be paid in lives. They had gravely, tragically, misunderstood the storm that was about to break. April 1941, in Taruhud, unforgiving terrain of North Africa. A new weapon of war was being unsheathed, but it wasn't forged in the great industrial furnaces of Europe. It was an ancient blade, a curved knife that seemed to belong more to a bygone era than to the modern battlefield. This was the Kukri, the inseparable companion of every Gurkha soldier. When German intelligence first reported on this peculiar weapon, the reaction was one of amusement and derision. In the high command offices in Berlin, officers scoffed. A knife. In an age of tanks, dive bombers, and machine guns, To them, it seemed like a relic, a pathetic symbol of a backward, colonial army clinging to outdated traditions. They saw it as proof of the British Empire's decline, forced to rely on what they considered primitive warriors with primitive tools. The German propaganda machine even began to spin tales of these knife-wielding savages, portraying them as a desperate last resort, not a genuine military threat. But the British officers who served alongside the Gurkhas knew better. They understood the kukri was far more than just a piece of sharpened steel. For them, it was a living piece of history, an extension of the soldier who carried it. They would explain to skeptical newcomers how the kukri was, first and foremost, a utility tool. In the dense jungles of Nepal, it was an indispensable instrument for survival, used for everything from chopping firewood and clearing paths to preparing food and building shelters. Its unique, forward-weighted design made it an incredibly efficient chopping tool, a cross between a knife and a hatchet. This practicality was not lost on the battlefield. A Gurkha could use his kukri to dig a trench, clear a firing line, or even open a can of rations. It was the ultimate multi-tool, born from centuries of necessity in the Himalayan foothills. Beyond its utility, the kukri held a deep cultural and spiritual significance. It was a symbol of courage, honor, and the warrior spirit of the Gurkha people. A young man receiving his first kukri was a rite of passage, a moment he became a protector of his family and village. Legend and folklore surrounded the blade. One popular belief, often repeated though not strictly true, was that a kukri, once drawn in anger, must taste blood before being sheathed, even if it was the owner's own. While this was more myth than military doctrine, it spoke volumes about the blade's fearsome reputation and the solemnity with which it was wielded. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a promise, a vow of unflinching resolve. When a Gurkha drew his kukri, it signaled that the fight had become personal, that there would be no retreat and no surrender. This starkly contrasted with the German perspective. The Wehrmacht was the epitome of modern, industrialized warfare. Their soldiers were equipped with the latest technology, the MP-40 submachine gun, the MG-42, and the superbly engineered Kar-9 8K rifle. Their doctrine was built around speed, firepower, and overwhelming force. In their strategic thinking, close-quarters combat was something to be avoided, a failure of planning. A battle should be won with shells and bullets from a distance, long before an enemy could get close enough to use a knife. The very idea of a planned, deliberate charge with blades drawn seemed absurd. A tactic from the Napoleonic Wars, not World War II. They saw the Gurkhas' reliance on the kukri, not as a strength, but as a glaring weakness. A sign that the British were ill-equipped for a modern fight. British commanders, however, saw an opportunity in this German mindset. They knew that the psychological impact of a weapon could be just as devastating as its physical effect. They recognized that the German army, for all its efficiency, was accustomed to a certain rhythm of war. They fought in daylight, relied on clear lines of sight, and trusted their machines. But what would happen when the sun went down? What would happen in the disorienting chaos of a night raid, where technology failed and the primal fear of the dark took over? This is where the Gurkhas and their kukris would shine. British officers began to train their Gurkha regiments specifically for silent, nocturnal operations. They were to be ghosts in the night, moving through enemy lines without a sound, a whisper of movement in the shadows. The plan was simple yet terrifying. Under the cloak of darkness, small units of Gurkhas would infiltrate German positions. They would bypass the machine gun nests and the sentry posts that felt so secure in the daylight. The objective wasn't to capture ground in the traditional sense, but to spread terror and chaos. The kukri was the perfect tool for this job. A rifle shot would give away your position. A grenade would wake the entire camp. But a silent blade in the dark, that was a different kind of warfare. It was intimate, personal, and utterly horrifying for the soldier on the receiving end. The goal was to shatter the enemy's morale, to make them afraid of the shadows, to make them question their safety even in their own trenches. The first of these night engagements were about to unfold. The German soldiers, confident in their technological superiority, would settle into their defensive positions as the African sun dipped below the horizon. They would check their ammunition, clean their rifles, and share jokes, feeling secure behind their barbed wire and machine guns. They were completely unaware of the figures moving like phantoms through the gullies and their faces darkened, their footsteps making no sound. These were the Gurkhas, their hands resting on the hilts of their curved blades. The Germans had mocked the Kukri. They had dismissed it as a relic, a sign of weakness. They were about to learn, in the most brutal way imaginable, how wrong they were. The laughter in the German trenches would soon be replaced by screams. The unseen blade was about to make its presence known, and the fear it would instill would become a legend, whispered in hushed tones from El Alamein to Monte Cassino. The night belonged to the Gurkha, and the Kukri was its king. The year is 1941. The vast, sun-scorched expanse of Cyrenaica in North Africa has become a critical chessboard in the Second World War. Here, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, leads his formidable Afrika Corps, pushing back the British Commonwealth forces with relentless efficiency. Hermann doctrine built on speed, firepower, and aggressive maneuver seemed unstoppable. Their soldiers, hardened veterans of the Blitzkrieg, carried an air of invincibility. They believed they were the masters of modern warfare, and the desert was just another landscape to conquer. But in the simmering heat of May, deep within the labyrinthine wadis and rocky escarpments near the Gazala line, this confidence was about to be shaken by an entirely new kind of adversary, an adversary that didn't play by their rules. Patrolling the perimeter were soldiers from a kingdom nestled in the Himalayas, thousands of miles away. The Gurkhas of the 4th Indian Division had arrived. To the Germans, they were an unknown quantity. Initial intelligence reports, colored by colonial era prejudice, dismissed them. They were seen as small, perhaps primitive colonial troops, armed with strange, curved honey. They were footnotes in briefings, an afterthought for an army focused on tanks and artillery. The Germans expected them to be easily scattered, inferior fighters, unsuited for the mechanized, lightning-fast warfare of the desert. This assumption was their first, and for many, their last mistake. The first encounters were not grand battles, but fleeting, terrifying skirmishes that defied German logic. A German reconnaissance patrol, perhaps a squad in an SDKFC 222 armored car, would push cautiously into a seemingly empty stretch of desert. The men, scanning the horizon for the glint of a rifle or the dust cloud of an enemy vehicle, felt secure. The landscape was open, barren, offering little cover. The engine's hum was the only sound, a comforting rhythm in the oppressive silence. They'd stopped to take readings, check their maps, confident in their isolation. Then the silence would break, but it wouldn't break with the expected thunder of machine guns or the whistle of incoming mortars. It would break with a soft thud, a choked cry, or to soothe an horrifying realization that the century it was standing just moments ago was gone. One German account from a shaken survivor described it as if ghosts had risen from the sand itself. There was no warning, no sound of approach. One moment, his comrade was leaning against a rock, lighting a cigarette. The next, he simply crumpled, a dark shape melting back into the shadows behind him. The rest of the patrol would scramble, spinning around, reefless ricid, finding nothing but the wind and the vast, empty terrain. Panic would set in. Where was the enemy? How could they move so silently? These were the Gurkhas. Raised in the rugged mountains of Nepal, they were masters of stealth and patience. The desert, which the Germans saw as a flat, exposed killing field, was to them just another landscape to be read and used. They moved not in rigid formations, but flowed like water through the terrain, using every rock, every dip in the ground, every shadow cast by the brutal sun. They understood that the desert's greatest weapon was its silence, and they made it their own. A German soldier wrote in his diary about the unnerving feeling of being watched. His unit would halt, and an inexplicable tension would descend. They couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything, but the primal instinct of being hunted was undeniable. The Gurkhas' tactics were a direct counter to the German way of war. While the Germans relied on overwhelming firepower and machinery, the Gurkhas relied on the individual skill and courage of the soldier. They were experts in ambush, A small patrol of 5 or 6 Gurkhas could neutralize a German squad twice their size. They would let the enemy pass, waiting with absolute stillness, sometimes for hours under the blistering sun. They wouldn't open fire from a distance. Instead, they would wait until the last possible moment, until the enemy was practically on top of them. Then, the attack would come. It was a whirlwind of controlled, lethal violence, a flurry of precise shots from their Lee-Enfield rifles, followed by an immediate, ferocious charge. And it was in these close-quarters moments that the Germans came face to face with the Gurkhas' most iconic and feared weapon. The Kukri. This wasn't just a knife, it was an extension of the soldier's will. For a German soldier accustomed to the bayonet charge, the sight of a Gurkha emerging from the dust, silent and swift, with that heavy, forward-curving blade, was a vision of primal terror. The charge was often accompanied by the chilling war cry, "Ayo, the Gurkhas are coming," a sound that would soon become legendary in the North African campaign. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers were trained to fight enemies they could see, to engage in firefights they could understand. How do you fight an enemy who isn't there 1 second and is upon you the next? How do you defend against silence? The first field reports sent back to German command were filled with confusion and disbelief. They described attacks by shadow men or silent killers. The descriptions were so strange, so contrary to their combat experience, that some commanders initially dismissed them as battlefield hysteria or exaggerations. One captured German officer, when interrogated, expressed his utter bewilderment. He spoke of his men's morale plummeting after just a few nights on the line. They weren't afraid of a pitched battle. They were afraid of the dark. They were afraid of the quiet moments between the fighting. They started seeing shapes in the rocks, hearing movement in the wind. The Gurkhas had done more than just inflict casualties. They had injected a potent dose of fear and uncertainty into the veins of the Afrika Korps. They had turned the desert, Rommel's own playground, into a place of unseen threats. These initial skirmishes in May 1941 were small in the grand scale of the war, but their impact was immense. They shattered the myth of German invincibility and the racist assumption that the Gurkhas were inferior soldiers. For the first time, the Germans encountered an infantry force that could out-stealth them, outmaneuver them in close terrain, and terrify them on a psychological level. The Gurkhas weren't fighting the Germans' war of machines. They were fighting their own war of stealth, surprise, and unflinching courage. The name Gurkha began to circulate through the German ranks, no longer as a footnote, but as a whisper of respect and dread. The seeds of a legend had been planted in the unforgiving sands of Cyrenaica, a legend that would only grow as the war raged on. The small soldiers from the mountains had proven that in the crucible of combat, the size of a soldier's heart and the sharpness of his blade matter far more than the size of his stature. June 1941. The vast, dark expanse of the North African desert swallows the last rays of sunlight. For the German Afrika Korps, nightfall doesn't bring rest. It brings a creeping, primal fear. This isn't just the absence of light, it's the arrival of something else. Something silent, deadly, and almost supernatural. Tonight, we delve into the story of how the Gurkhas became the stuff of nightmares for Rommel's elite soldiers. This is the tale of Chapter 4. Night falls, fear rises. The German forward outposts were positioned to be impregnable. Barbed wire, machine gun nests, and vigilant sentries scanning the moonlit sands. They were confident, trained, and equipped for anything the desert could throw at them. Or so they thought. The first sign that something was wrong was always the silence. A sentry post that was supposed to report in every 15 minutes suddenly goes quiet. No gunshot, no scream, just an unnerving, absolute stillness where a human voice should be. A corporal, let's call him Klaus, is sent to check. He creeps forward, rifle ready, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He reaches the sandbagged position. The sentry isn't there. There's no sign of a struggle. The rifle is leaning against the wall, untouched. The only thing out of place is a dark, wet stain soaking into the sand, almost invisible in the dim light. Klaus feels a cold dread snake up his spine. He calls out his comrade's name. First a whisper, then a shout. Only the desert wind answers. Panic is a virus, and it spreads fast. Back in the main trench, the officers try to maintain calm. He must have wandered off, one suggests, his voice lacking conviction. Maybe a scorpion. Another mutters, knowing full well it's a lie. But then, another post goes silent. And another. The radio crackles with increasingly frantic calls, all met with the same chilling void. The Germans are blind. They are surrounded by an enemy they cannot see, cannot hear, and cannot fight. The night wears on, each second stretching into an eternity. Soldiers huddle together, their eyes wide, jumping at every shadow, every whisper of the wind. They listen, straining their ears for the slightest sound of an approaching enemy, but there is nothing. The Gurkhas don't make noise. They are masters of the night, moving with a fluidity that seems to defy the laws of physics. They are one with the shadows, their dark uniforms blending seamlessly with the terrain. They are specters, ghosts of the battlefield. As dawn finally breaks, the true horror is revealed. The missing sentries are found, but not how anyone expected. They haven't been taken prisoner. The evidence left behind is brutal and unmistakable. Deep, clean cuts, made by a heavy, curved blade. The Gurkha's signature weapon, the Kukri. The sight sends a fresh wave of terror through the German ranks. This wasn't a conventional attack. This was a hunt. It was a message, written in the language of cold steel. The psychological impact was devastating, far more effective than any artillery barrage. German soldiers, battle-hardened veterans who had faced the best of the British army, were now terrified of the dark. They started trading stories, hushed and fearful, around campfires. Die spoke of Gespenstersoldaten, ghost soldiers, phantoms who could slit a man's throat without him ever knowing they were there. They said these men were short, impossibly strong, and carried knives that could sever a limb in a single stroke. One captured German officer's diary entry perfectly captured the growing legend. He wrote, "We are not fighting men anymore. We are fighting demons. They come from the shadows, kill without a sound, and disappear into the night." Our morale is shattering. The men see shadows in every corner and believe the Gurkhas can walk through walls. To face a British Tommy is to face a soldier. To face a Gurkha is to face a spirit of death itself. The Gurkha strategy was genius in its simplicity and brutality. They weren't just eliminating enemy soldiers. They were dismantling the enemy's will to fight. Each silent raid, each Kukri strike, was a calculated act of psychological warfare. They turned the Germans' greatest asset, their discipline and order, into a liability. How can you maintain discipline when your men are convinced they're being hunted by ghosts? The rumors grew more and more fantastical. Some claimed the Gurkhas could make themselves invisible. Others swore they could leap over trenches in a single bound. The truth was, in a way, even more terrifying. The Gurkhas weren't supernatural. They were simply the product of relentless training, iron discipline, and a cultural warrior ethos that stretched back centuries. They had mastered the art of stealth to a degree the Germans couldn't even comprehend. Their night raids became legendary. They would slip through barbed wire like smoke, navigate minefields by instinct, and eliminate entire machine gun crews before a single alarm could be raised. They targeted supply lines, officers' quarters, and communication hubs, causing chaos and paralysis. They didn't need overwhelming numbers. A small team of Gurkhas could inflict more damage on morale than a full-scale assault. Imagine being a young German soldier, thousands of miles from home, in a hostile desert. You've been told you are part of the superior fighting force, but every night, you'll lie awake, listening to the silence, wondering if you'll be the next to vanish, wondering if one of those ghost soldiers is watching you right now, their hand resting on the hilt of that fearsome curved blade. The fear was constant, gnawing, and inescapable. The Gurkhas' reputation became a weapon in itself. The mere whisper that Gurkha regiments were operating in the area was enough to cause unease. Their battle cry, "Ao Gurkhali," the Gurkhas are upon you, was rarely heard, because by the time you heard it, it was already too late. They preferred the sound of silence, punctuated by the swift, deadly work of the Kukri. This chapter of history demonstrates a timeless truth of warfare. The battle is often won not on the field, but in the mind. The Gurkhas understood this better than anyone. They didn't just fight the Afrika Korps. They haunted them. They became a living, breathing embodiment of fear, a dark legend whispered on the desert wind. They proved that the most powerful weapon isn't always the one that makes the loudest noise, but the one that leaves behind the deepest silence. The stories of these night raids, of the ghost soldiers of the desert, would echo through the entire North African campaign. They cemented the Gurkha status as one of the most feared and respected fighting forces in the world. Their legacy is a stark reminder that in the theater of war, fear can be as decisive as firepower. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the night. The story of the Gurkhas is filled with incredible moments of courage and skill. September 1941. The North African sun beat down relentlessly. But inside a German command tent near Tobruk, a different kind of heat was rising. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, leaned over a makeshift table. Spread before him wasn't a map of troop movements, but a collection of captured equipment. A strange, curved knife to Kukri lay next to a soldier's paybook and a neatly folded turban. This wasn't standard British gear. It belonged to the 4th Indian Division, specifically its Gurkha battalions. For months, German intelligence reports had been dismissive. They referred to the Commonwealth forces as a mix of British regulars and colonial auxiliaries, implying a less motivated fighting force. The Gurkhas from Nepal were often lumped into this category, seen as little more than conscripts from a remote mountain kingdom, brought in to fill the ranks. But the reality on the ground was telling a very different story. The dispatches from the front lines were changing in tone, from confident to cautious, and now to outright concerned. Rommel picked up an interrogation summary. It was from a captured Gurkha soldier, a young man barely out of his teens. The German officer who questioned him noted something remarkable. The prisoner was disciplined, almost unnervingly so. He gave his name, rank, and serial number, and nothing more. No amount of pressure, no offers of comfort could get him to reveal his unit's strength, position, or objectives. He was, the report concluded, fiercely loyal to his British officers and his regiment. Another report detailed the aftermath of a recent skirmish. A German patrol had stumbled upon a Gurkha outpost. The fighting was brief, but brutal. The Germans, accustomed to opponents who would fall back under fire, were stunned by the tenacity of the defense. The Gurkhas held their ground, fighting with a ferocity that was shocking. They were masters of camouflage, experts with their rifles, and when the distance closed, they wielded those curved kukris with terrifying effectiveness. Rommel's staff officers murmured amongst themselves. They examined the captured pit. The entries were meticulous. The soldiers were not conscripts. Were long-serving professionals. Their training records showed extensive drills in marksmanship, bayonet fighting, and importantly, trench raiding and close-quarters combat. These were not second-rate troops. This was a warrior culture, refined over a century of service with the British Army. The Germans had always prided themselves on their own professional military ethos. They respected a worthy adversary, and what they were seeing here was forcing a major reassessment. The Gurkhas were not just auxiliaries, they were an elite force, every bit as professional and dangerous as a German Jäger or One of Rommel's aides, Major Friedrich von Mayentin, a sharp intelligence officer, pointed to a paragraph in a new intelligence digest. He read it aloud. It was a formal revision of the previous assessment. The document now explicitly warned field commanders about underestimating the Gurkha units. It described their exceptional fieldcraft, their physical toughness honed in the Himalayas, and their unbreakable morale. It noted that they were volunteers, not just in the British Indian Army, but volunteers for the most dangerous missions, the night raids and patrols, deep into no. This was a pivotal moment. For the first time in an official German military document from the North African campaign, the May Fetofti colonial auxiliary was shattered. The Gurkhas were now recognized for what they were, elite soldiers. A new directive was drafted to be circulated among the Afrika Korps. It instructed troops on the specific tactics used by the Gurkhas and warned them to be especially vigilant at night. The quiet, stealthy approach, followed by the terrifying cry of Ao Gorkali. The Gurkhas, are upon you, was now something every German soldier in the desert would learn to fear. Rommel straightened up, his expression grim but respectful. He had built his reputation on understanding his enemy, and his enemy had just become a lot more formidable. He understood that these small, quiet men from a faraway land were not to be taken lightly. They were professional, disciplined, and deadly. In the vast, unforgiving desert, the legend of the Gurkha was being written in sand and blood, and even the desert fox was taking notice. The dispatches sent back to Berlin that week would carry a new weight of respect and caution. The nature of the war in the desert had just fundamentally changed. October 1942. The North African desert is a vast, unforgiving sea of sand, bleached bone-white. Under a relentless sun, 4 months, 2 colossal armies have been locked in a deadly stalemate. Their front lines etched into the desolate landscape around a dusty railway stop called El Alim. On one side, Erwin Rommel's famed Afrika Korps, masters of desert warfare. On the other, the British Eighth Army, desperate to break the Axis grip on Egypt and the Suez Canal. The fate of the entire war in North Africa hangs in the balance. As twilight descends on the 23rd of October, a new sound joins the desert wind, a sound that will echo in the nightmares of German veterans for years to come. It's the skirl of bagpipes, a strange, haunting melody drifting across no man's land. Operation Lightfoot is about to begin. The Second Battle of El Alamein has started, and with it, one of the largest artillery barrages since the First World War. Over 1,000 British guns open up simultaneously, their muzzle flashes, tearing the night apart. A rolling thunder that shakes the very ground. The desert erupts in a storm of fire and steel. Under this apocalyptic canopy of explosions, shadowy figures begin to move. They are men of the 4th Indian Division, a hardened formation comprised of British, Indian, and Gurkha soldiers. Among them, the legendary Gurkhas, men from the mountains of Nepal, their faces set like stone. They are small in stature, but their reputation is immense. Tonight, that reputation will be forged anew in the crucible of El Alamein. Their objective is a series of heavily fortified German positions, a lethal labyrinth of machine gun nests, mortar pits, and trenches, all protected by vast minefields and concertina wire. These are the defensive strongpoints that have bloodied the Eighth Army for months, manned by battle-hardened veterans of the Afrika Korps. For the Gurkhas, this is not a battle of tanks and grand maneuvers. This is a battle of inches, of bayonets, and fighting knives. As the artillery barrage lifts, a chilling cry rises above the din of battle. Ayo Gurkhali. The Gurkhas are coming. They surge forward into the maelstrom. They don't run in a disorganized mob. They move with disciplined speed, flowing through gaps in the wire cut by sappers, navigating the treacherous minefields with an uncanny sixth sense. The moonlight glints off their most feared weapon, the Kukri, its curved blade a symbol of their warrior heritage. The first German machine gun nests open up, spitting tracers that crisscross the night sky. But the Gurkhas are like phantoms. They use every fold in the terrain, every shell crater for cover, advancing in short, sharp rushes. One moment, the Germans see nothing but dust and shadows. The next, the Gurkhas are upon them, pouring into the trenches like a vengeful tide. What follows is sheer, brutal, close-quarters combat. This is the Gurkhas' element. In the claustrophobic confines of the trenches, rifles are too cumbersome, and the close-packed chaos negates the advantage of machine guns. It becomes a primal struggle of blade against blade, hand against hand. German soldiers, who have faced down charging tanks and survived massive bombardments, now find themselves in a fight for which nothing could have prepared them. The Gurkhas are relentless. They vault over sandbags, their war cries piercing the air. A German machine gunner swivels his weapon, only to be met by a silent shadow that appears as if from the earth itself. The glint of a Kukri, a swift, decisive strike, and the gun falls silent. Another group of German grenadiers, preparing to throw their stick grenades, are overwhelmed before they can even pull the pins. After-action reports from German veterans who survived these encounters paint a terrifying picture. They speak not of ordinary soldiers, but of something more. They describe the Gurkhas as being utterly fearless, moving through hails of gunfire as if they were invincible. One captured officer, a hardened veteran of the Eastern Front, stated, "I have fought in Russia, in Poland, in France. I have never seen anything like the Gurkhas. They are not men, they are demons." This wasn't just about physical prowess. It was about psychological dominance. The Gurkhas fought with a ferocity that was both silent and terrifying. They moved with a predatory grace, their dark eyes fixed on their objective. There was no hesitation, no quarter asked, and none given. For the soldiers of the Afrika Korps, who took pride in their own martial spirit, this was deeply unsettling. They were used to being the ones who instilled fear, not the ones who felt it. Throughout the night and into the grueling days that followed, the Gurkha battalions of the 4th Indian Division systematically dismantled the German defenses in their sector. They took key positions like the Ruasad Ridge, a critical piece of high ground that had defied previous attacks. Each position was taken the same way, with overwhelming speed, precision, and an almost supernatural ferocity in close combat. The cost was high, with many brave Gurkhas falling in the desert sand, far from their Himalayan homes. But they never broke. They never retreated. They were, as one German account described them, unbreakable. By the end of the battle, the legend of the Gurkhas had spread like wildfire through the Axis ranks. They became one of the very few Allied units that the infantry of the Afrika Korps genuinely feared. The mere rumor of Gurkhas being on their section of the front was enough to cause a palpable drop in morale. The sound of bagpipes, once a curious anomaly, was now a harbinger of doom. The sight of a Kukri became a symbol of a swift and certain end. The Second Battle of El Alamein was a turning point in the Second World War. It marked the beginning of the end for the Axis powers in North Africa. This victory was achieved through the combined efforts of many brave soldiers from across the Commonwealth. But on those moonlit desert nights and the bloody trenches and fortified pits, the Gurkhas carved out their own unique chapter in the annals of warfare. They proved that courage is not measured by height or by the sophistication of one's weapons. It is measured by the spirit, by the willingness to advance into the jaws of death, with a battle cry on your lips and a blade in your hand. The Hell of El Alamein was a testament to their legacy of fierce loyalty, unmatched bravery, and the chilling, undeniable truth whispered in the German trenches. The Gurkhas are coming. The tide of war was turning. By January 1943, the Allies had broken the back of the Axis forces in North Africa. The German Afrika Korps, once the terror of the desert, was in full retreat, its remnants squeezed into Tunisia. The victorious British 8th Army, alongside their American counterparts, stood on the shores of the Mediterranean, looking north. Their next target was clear: the soft underbelly of Europe, Italy. For the Gurkhas of the 4th Indian Division, the long and brutal desert campaign was finally over. The dust, the heat, and the endless expanse of sand were about to be replaced by a landscape that was both foreign and yet strangely familiar. The plan was codenamed Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. This massive amphibious and airborne operation would be the largest of the war to date, a crucial stepping stone to mainland Italy. The objective was to knock Italy out of the war, secure Mediterranean shipping lanes, and divert German divisions from the Eastern Front, where the Soviets were locked in a titanic struggle. For the Gurkhas, this meant a transition from desert warfare to a new kind of fight. They would be trading their sand-colored fatigues for jungle green and their desert tactics for mountain combat. It was a change they were uniquely suited for. As part of General Montgomery's 8th Army, the Gurkhas boarded troop ships, leaving the shores of Africa behind. The sea voyage was a brief respite, a moment of calm before the storm. The men, hailing from the towering Himalayas of Nepal, looked out at the vast blue expanse of the Mediterranean. Many had never seen such a large body of water. They cleaned their rifles, sharpened their kukris, and mentally prepared for the battles ahead. Their reputation had preceded them. Stories of their ferocity in the desert, their silent night raids, and the terrifying cry of Aog had spread not just through Allied ranks, but more importantly, through the German ones. On the 10th of July, 1943, the invasion began. The Gurkhas landed on the southeastern coast of Sicily. The initial resistance from Italian coastal divisions was often light and disorganized, but the real challenge lay inland. The island's interior was a maze of rugged mountains, steep hills, and winding roads. A defender's paradise, the German high command was confident. They believed this terrain would bog down the Allied advance, allowing their elite units, like the Hermann Göring Panzer Division and battle-hardened paratroopers, to inflict heavy casualties and fight a protracted, bloody withdrawal. They had prepared defensive lines along the high ground, turning every ridge and mountain pass into a fortress. What the Germans hadn't fully accounted for was the Gurkhas, while tanks and mechanized infantry struggled on the narrow, treacherous mountain roads. The Gurkhas moved with an agility and speed that stunned their opponents. This was their element. The steep, rocky slopes of Sicily were a world away from the flat desert, but they were a mirror of the foothills of their homeland. They moved like ghosts through the difficult terrain, bypassing fortified roads and well-defended positions by scaling slopes that the Germans had deemed impassable. A German officer captured during these early battles expressed his astonishment. His position was on a high, seemingly inaccessible cliff. They had machine guns and mortars trained on the only road leading up. They felt secure, untouchable. Then, as dusk fell, they heard a faint shuffling from the cliffs behind them. Before they could react, a wave of silent figures rose from the rocks, kukris glinting in the twilight. The attack was swift, brutal, and utterly terrifying. The Germans had been so focused on the conventional approach that they never considered an enemy could simply climb a sheer rock face to get at them. That captured officer learned a hard lesson. For a Gurkha, a cliff is not an obstacle, it's a staircase. The fighting in Sicily was intense. The Germans, particularly the Fallschirmjäger paratroopers, were tough, experienced soldiers. They fought tenaciously for every inch of ground. But time and again, they found themselves outmaneuvered and outfought by the men from Nepal. The Gurkhas specialized in infiltration. Under the cover of darkness, they would slip through German lines, their footsteps silent on the rocky ground. They would identify command posts, artillery positions, and supply dumps. Then, just before dawn, they would strike. A flurry of grenades, a few bursts from a Bren gun, the flash of a Kukri, and it was over. The chaos and confusion they sowed in the German rear were as effective as any frontal assault. One particularly famous engagement involved the capture of a key mountain stronghold. The Germans had dug in deep, with interlocking fields of machine gun fire. A conventional assault would have been suicidal, so the Gurkhas did what they did best. A small party, under the command of a young Sabiter, spent an entire day observing the German position from a distance. They memorized the sentry patterns, the machine gun nests, the command bunker. That night, armed with little more than their rifles, grenades, and their kukris, they began their ascent up a sheer, unguarded rock face. It was a climb that would have challenged professional mountaineers. They moved in complete silence, each man trusting the man above him. They reached the summit just as the sky began to lighten. The German sentries, tired after a long night, were looking down the mountain, not up. The Gurkhas fell upon them like a thunderbolt. The surprise was total. The garrison was overwhelmed in minutes. By the time the main Allied force began its cautious advance up the road, the Gurkhas were already brewing tea on the captured summit, the Union Jack flying from the German command post. This pattern was repeated across the island. The Germans would establish a strong defensive line on a ridge, only to wake up and find Gurkhas on the same ridge, behind them. The psychological impact was immense. The fear that had begun in the sands of Africa had followed them across the sea. German soldiers started whispering about the little men who came from nowhere. After 38 days of brutal combat, Sicily fell. The campaign had been a resounding success, but it was just the beginning. The next objective was mainland Italy itself. In September 1943, the 8th Army, including its Gurkha battalions, crossed the Strait of Messina and landed at the toe of Italy. The German commander-in-chief in Italy, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, was a master of defensive warfare. He intended to make the Allies pay for every mile. He used the country's formidable geography, the long, mountainous spine of the Apennines, to create a series of heavily fortified defensive lines that stretched from coast to coast. The most famous of these would be the Gustav Line. For the Italian campaign became a relentless series of mountain battles. Places like Monte Cassino, Sangro River, and the Gothic line would be etched into their history with blood. The conditions were often appalling. The bitter cold of the Italian winter, the constant rain and snow, and the mud that seemed to swallow everything were a far cry from the heat of the desert. Yet, they adapted, and their endurance, their mountain skills, and their sheer fighting spirit were indispensable. They became the Allied commanders' go-to troops for cracking the toughest mountain defenses. When a position was deemed too difficult, too costly to take by regular infantry, the call would go out, send in the Gurkhas. The Germans who had faced them in Africa and Sicily now held them in a kind of fearful respect. They knew that a quiet night on the front line could be deceptive. They knew that the silent shadows in the mountains could coalesce into deadly warriors at any moment. The legend of the Gurkha, the fearless mountain fighter with his curved knife, was no longer just a story. For the German soldier in Italy, it was a terrifying reality that haunted the high peaks and dark valleys of the Alps. The journey from the Himalayas had been long, but in the mountains of Italy, the Gurkhas were finally home, and for their enemies, that was the most frightening prospect of all. In the brutal winter of 1944, the road to Rome was blocked by one of the most formidable defensive positions of World War II. The Gustav Line, anchored by the ancient monastery of Monte Cassino. For 4 long months, this mountain became a hell on earth, a meat grinder that consumed entire divisions. And into this crucible of fire and steel stepped some of the most feared and respected soldiers of the war. The story of the Gurkhas at Cassino is one of almost superhuman courage and resilience. The German defenders, elite Fallschirm, Gehr, or paratroopers, were dug in deep. They were battle-hardened veterans, masters of defense, and they had turned the mountain and the ruins of the bombed-out abbey into a fortress of death. Allied attacks had been thrown back time and time again with horrific casualties. The terrain was a nightmare, steep, treacherous, and covered in razor-sharp rock and rubble. Every approach was covered by machine guns, mortars, and snipers. It was into this seemingly impossible situation that the 4th Indian Division, which included several Gurkha battalions, was committed. Their primary objective was a feature that struck fear into the hearts of all who saw it. Point 593, a barren, rocky outcrop that dominated the approaches to the monastery. It was nicknamed Hangman's Hill for a good reason. To take it was considered a suicide mission. But the Gurkhas were no ordinary soldiers. Raised in the Himalayas, these men were masters of mountain warfare. Where others saw impassable cliffs, they saw pathways. On the night of February 15th, under the cover of a tremendous artillery barrage, the 1st Battalion of the 9th Gurkha Rifles began their ascent. They moved with a stealth that defied belief, scaling near vertical rock faces in the darkness, their movements as silent as shadows. The Germans, secure in the belief that no attack could come from that direction, were caught completely by surprise. The fighting that erupted on those slopes was savage, a desperate struggle fought with bayonets, grenades, and the iconic Kukri knives. The Gurkhas swarmed over the German positions, their famous battle cry, "O Gurkhali, the Gurkhas are coming," echoing through the ruins. They took Hangman's Hill, a feat that had been deemed impossible, but holding it was another matter entirely. For days, the Gurkhas clung to their precarious foothold, isolated and under constant, ferocious The Germans, recognizing the extreme danger posed by these warriors, threw everything they had at them. The air was thick with shrapnel and cordite. Supplies of food, water, and ammunition were almost non-existent, often airdropped and lost down the treacherous slopes. The men survived on snow for water and fought with the ammunition of the fallen, both friend and foe. It's here that the legend of the Gurkha at Cassino was truly forged, not just in their attack, but in their tenacity. The German paratroopers, themselves among the finest soldiers in the world, developed a profound and lasting respect for their opponents. They had never encountered anything like the Gurkha. In post-battle reports and interrogations of captured Fallschirmjäger, a consistent theme emerged. One German officer was quoted as saying, "The Gurkhas were the most formidable infantry assault troops we ever faced. They were masters of the terrain, silent in movement, and terrifyingly deadly in close-quarters combat." Another captured paratrooper described the unnerving experience of seeing them appear as if from nowhere. He spoke of their ability to climb impossible cliffs and infiltrate rubble-filled ruins where no one thought a man could pass. The Germans would set up machine gun nests in what they thought were inaccessible positions, only to find them silenced in the night by a silent blade. The Kukri became a symbol of terror for the defenders of Cassino. The psychological impact was immense. The thought of a Gurkha patrol prowling the darkness was often more terrifying than the shelling. During the third battle for Cassino in March, codenamed Operation Dickens, the Gurkhas were once again at the forefront. After a massive aerial and artillery bombardment that flattened the town at the base of the mountain, the 1st Battalion of the 4th Gurkha Rifles fought their way through the shattered streets. They advanced into a labyrinth of rubble, a chaotic landscape perfect for ambush. The fighting was house to house, or rather, ruin to ruin. Every pile of debris could hide a machine gun. Every darkened cellar could hold a squad of determined defenders. The Gurkhas displayed incredible bravery. One story tells of Rifleman Bombak. His company was pinned down by multiple enemy machine gun posts. With no thought for his own safety, he charged forward alone. He took out the first post with grenades. He then rushed a second, killing the gunner with his bayonet. He cleared enemy foxholes with grenades and his kukri. Finally, he braved intense fire to knock out a mortar position. His single-handed action saved his company and allowed the advance to continue. For this, he was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest honor for gallantry. His citation reads like something out of a Hollywood movie, but it was brutally real, and he was not alone. Countless acts of similar, unrecorded bravery took place in the chaos of Cassino. The Gurkhas paid a heavy price for their courage. Casualties were devastating. Battalions were reduced to a fraction of their strength. They held Hangman's Hill and other key positions for days on end against overwhelming odds. But ultimately, the wider attack stalled. The 4th Indian Division was eventually withdrawn, battered but unbowed. Though they didn't take the monastery itself in these assaults, their actions were crucial. They had bled the elite German defenders, tying them down and proving that even their most formidable positions could be breached. They had carved a legend into the rock of that mountain, a legend acknowledged and respected by their sworn enemies. When the final, successful assault on Cassino was launched in May 1944 by Polish forces, the path had been paved in part by the blood and sacrifice of the Gurkhas. They had shown what was possible, instilling a sense of awe and dread in the defenders that lingered long after they had left the line. The story of the Gurkhas at Monte Cassino is more than just a battle report. It's a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure and overcome the unimaginable. It's a story of warriors who, through their unparalleled skill, bravery, and sheer will to fight, earned the undying respect of their foes in one of the most brutal battles in modern history. The whispers of Gurkha on that Italian mountain still echo through the annals of military history today. In the brutal Italian campaign of World War II, amid the mud and chaos of June 1944, some of the most feared soldiers on the planet were silently on the move. These were the Gurkhas, men from the mountains of Nepo, whose reputation for courage and ferocity preceded them wherever they went. Their next objective was a heavily fortified position known as Hill 193, a German strongpoint bristling with machine guns and hardened defenders. As Allied forces pushed north towards the Gothic line, this hill was a critical obstacle, and taking it would require something special. What followed would be a masterclass in stealth, terror, and the art of close-quarters combat, a night that German soldiers would forever remember as the Night of No Mercy. The task fell to a company of the 4th Battalion of the 10th Gurkha Rifles. Standard daylight assaults against such a position would be suicidal, a meat grinder of machine gun fire and artillery. The Gurkha officers, however, knew their men possessed a unique set of skills, perfectly suited for a different approach. They would attack under the cover of absolute darkness, relying not on overwhelming firepower, but on silence, surprise, and the dreaded Kukri knife. As dusk settled over the Italian countryside, the Gurkhas began their preparations. They weren't loading belts of ammunition for a long firefight. Instead, they were sharpening their kukris, the iconic curved knives that were both a tool and a terrifyingly effective weapon. Each man moved with quiet purpose, their faces grim and determined. They knew the plan was incredibly risky. One mistake, one stray sound, could bring a storm of German fire down upon them. As night fell, a deep, impenetrable darkness blanketed the landscape. The Gurkhas slipped out of their positions, melting into the shadows. They didn't advance in a straight line up the hill. Instead, they used the terrain to their advantage, moving like phantoms through shell craters and the tangled vines of the local vineyards. Their movements were impossibly quiet. Clad in soft-soled boots and carrying minimal gear to avoid any rattling, they were like ghosts drifting through the night. The German sentries on Hill 193 scanned the darkness, listening for the telltale sounds of an approaching enemy, the clank of a rifle, a misplaced footstep on loose gravel. But they heard nothing. The silence was absolute, unnerving. They had no idea that death was creeping up the hill, one silent footfall at a time. The Gurkhas moved with an instinct born from generations of mountain life. They understood the land, the shadows, the very texture of the ground beneath their feet. They bypassed the most obvious approaches, instead flanking the German positions, moving through areas the defenders considered impassable. As they drew closer, the tension was palpable. The faint murmur of German voices carried on the night air, the occasional flare briefly illuminating the sky, revealing nothing but empty ground. The Germans felt secure in their concrete bunkers and deep trenches, confident that no enemy could reach them without a massive, noisy preparatory bombardment. They were wrong. The Gurkhas had already breached their outer perimeter without a single shot being fired. They were now inside the wire, moving between the German fighting positions, preparing to strike from the one direction the enemy never expected. From behind, the assault began, not with a bang, but with a whisper and a flash of steel. The first German sentry was silenced before he could even cry out, a Gurkha emerging from the darkness behind him. The attack was a coordinated, simultaneous strike on multiple positions. The Germans in their foxholes and machine gun nests suddenly realized they weren't alone. One moment they were peering into the darkness ahead, and the next, a silent figure was upon them. The terror was unimaginable. These weren't soldiers firing from a distance. These were attackers appearing out of thin air, armed with heavy, curved finneebies. The distinctive shape of the Kukri, glimpsed in the faint moonlight, was the last thing many Germans saw. Panic erupted. Shouts and screams of gore echoed across the hilltop as defenders realized they were being overrun from within their own lines. The psychological impact was devastating. The Germans were trained for conventional warfare, for battles of artillery and machine guns. They were not prepared for this silent, brutal, close-quarters slaughter. A soldier would turn to find the man next to him gone, only to be confronted by a Gurkha himself. The fighting was primal and swift. In the confusion and darkness, German soldiers began firing wildly, sometimes hitting their own men. The disciplined, cohesive defense of Hill 193 completely disintegrated into chaos and individual survival. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a hunt. The Gurkhas, masters of the night and the knife, moved through the trenches with deadly efficiency, clearing one position after another. The night that was supposed to offer safety and cover for the defenders had become their worst nightmare, a suffocating blanket of terror from which there was no escape. The legend of the Gurkhas was already well known among German troops on the Italian front. Stories of their ferocity and their almost supernatural ability to move unseen were passed down in hushed tones. Before the men on Hill 193, the legend became a horrifying reality. Survivors later recounted the sheer panic that gripped them. They spoke of abandoning their machine guns and mortars, weapons that were useless against an enemy who was already among them. They didn't just retreat, they fled in terror, casting aside their equipment and running blindly into the darkness, preferring to take their chances with their own artillery than face the silent men with the curved knives. The mere rumor that the Gurkhas were coming was often enough to cause a defensive line to waver. On Hill 193, the reality was infinitely worse. By the time the sun began to rise, the fighting was over. Hill 193, a position that could have cost hundreds of Allied lives in a conventional assault, had been taken. The cost to the Gurkhas was remarkably light, a testament to their skill and the element of surprise. The scene on the hilltop was a grim testament to the ferocity of the night's battle. The Gurkhas consolidated their new position, their objective secured. This single night action had a ripple effect, far beyond the capture of one hill. News of the attack spread like wildfire through the German ranks. The psychological weapon was now fully deployed. The name Gurkha became synonymous with night terrors. German commanders found that their troops were becoming increasingly reluctant to hold isolated forward positions at night, fearing a repeat of Hill 193. The legacy of that night in June 1944 is a powerful reminder that warfare is not just about firepower and technology. It's about psychology, courage, and the will to fight. The Gurkhas of the 10th Rifles didn't just capture a piece of ground. They shattered the morale of their enemy. They proved that a small force of highly skilled, audacious soldiers could overcome a numerically superior and well-fortified enemy by using their unique strengths. Their silent assault on Hill 193 is a lesser-known, but brilliant example of Special Forces tactics, long before the term became common. It stands as a tribute to the incredible bravery and martial prowess of the Gurkha soldier, a warrior whose motto, "Better to die than to be a coward," was proven not in words, but in a silent, deadly action on a dark Italian hillside. September 1944, the tide of war in Europe had decisively turned for the soldiers of the German Wehrmacht, fighting on multiple fronts. The realities of combat had shattered many of the myths spun by their own propaganda machine. For years, the narrative had been one of Aryan supremacy, where their enemies were portrayed as inferior, weak, or unworthy. But on the brutal battlefields of Italy, a different story was being written in blood and steel, a story that forced a grudging and then open admiration for a unique and fearsome opponent. Imagine you're a fresh-faced German recruit, barely out of your teens, being rushed to the Italian front. The veterans, men with hollowed eyes who have seen the horrors of Monte Cassino and the Gustav Line, pull you aside. They don't speak of the Americans or the British with any particular reverence. But then, their tone changes. They lean in close and say, "Listen, if you are ever deployed against the Indians, pray you are not facing the little men. If you meet the Gurkhas, you will be fighting the very best soldiers the British have." This wasn't propaganda. This was a stark, battlefield-forged warning. Initially, German intelligence reports and propaganda had been dismissive. The Gurkhas, hailing from the distant mountains of Nepal, were often lumped in with other colonial troops, depicted as mere cannon fodder for the British Empire. They were described in condescending terms, their small stature mocked, their fighting prowess underestimated. But experience is a brutal teacher. As German units repeatedly clashed with Gurkha brigades in the rugged, mountainous terrain of Italy, this dismissive attitude began to crumble, replaced by a mixture of fear, respect, and awe. The shift is palpable when you look at the captured documents and post-war testimonies from German soldiers. The language evolves dramatically. Early reports might mention Nepalese mercenaries, but by late 1944, the terminology changes. They are called elite mountain troops, silent hunters, and unrivaled masters of close-quarters combat. The mockery vanishes, replaced by a professional respect that is rare between opposing armies. German officers began writing detailed analyses of Gurkha tactics, not to belittle them, but to understand and counter them. They noted their incredible fieldcraft, their ability to move silently through the most difficult terrain, and their terrifying effectiveness in night raids. One of the most significant signs of this newfound respect was the comparison German soldiers began to make. They started comparing the Gurkhas to their own elite mountain infantry, the highly praised and respected group. For a German soldier to compare an enemy to the Gebirgsheer was the ultimate compliment. These were their own alpine specialists, men who were masters of mountain warfare, renowned for their toughness, skill, and endurance. In letters home and in official after-action reports, German soldiers would write things like, "We faced the Gurkhas today. They are like our own Gebirgsheer, perhaps even more at home in these hills." This wasn't just about their skill with a rifle. It was about the entire ethos of the Gurkha soldier. The Germans were particularly unnerved by the Gurkhas' signature weapon, the Kukri. The psychological impact of this curved blade was immense. Stories, often exaggerated but rooted in truth, spread like wildfire through the German trenches. Tales of sentries disappearing without a sound, of terrifying nighttime assaults, where the only warning was a chilling cry of followed by a devastatingly swift and silent attack. The Kukri became a symbol not just of a weapon, but of an entirely different philosophy of warfare, one that was intimate, personal, and utterly terrifying. A German officer's diary, captured near the Gothic line, provides a fascinating window into this mindset. He wrote, "The British are predictable. The Americans are reliant on their machines. But the they're different. They fight like men, not like cogs in a war machine. They have the cunning of a predator and the courage of a lion. To underestimate them is a fatal mistake. 1 hour command made for too long." This sentiment was echoed across the front. German units that had successfully held off larger Allied forces would often find their morale shattered after a single, well-executed night raid by a small Gurkha patrol. The respect went beyond mere fear. There was a genuine professional admiration. The Germans, who prided themselves on their martial traditions and discipline, recognized a kindred spirit in the Gurkhas. They saw a warrior culture that was deeply ingrained, a sense of duty and honor that they themselves held in high regard. They saw soldiers who were not just fighting for a wage, but who fought with a fierce pride in their regiment and their heritage. In the strange brotherhood of combat, where soldiers on opposite sides often have more in common with each other than with the civilians back home, the German soldier in Italy came to see the Gurkha not as an inferior colonial subject, but as a fellow mountain warrior of the highest caliber. This shift wasn't a formal policy change dictated from Berlin. It was a grassroots phenomenon, a truth that emerged from the harsh reality of the Italian campaign. It was born in the shell-scarred hills, in the desperate hand-to-hand fights for ridges and farmhouses. The official propaganda might continue its hollow narrative, but for the men on the ground, the truth was undeniable. When a German platoon saw the distinctive slouch hats and the small, determined figures of a Gurkha patrol moving through the rocks, they knew they were in for the fight of their lives. So, when a veteran NCO told a new recruit, "You will be fighting the best soldiers Britain has," it was more than a warning. It was a mark of respect, a testament to the fact that the Gurkhas had not only proven their courage and skill, but had fundamentally changed the perception of their enemy. They had fought their way into the very heart of the German consciousness, earning a reputation that would last long after the war was over. They had become legends, not just in the eyes of their allies, but in the eyes of the very men they were fighting. This profound respect from one of the most professional and battle-hardened armies in modern history is perhaps one of the greatest tributes to the Gurkha soldier. It underscores a timeless truth of warfare, that courage, skill, and honor are universal qualities, recognized and respected even by those on the other side of the firing line. The mountains of Italy became the crucible where the Gurkhas' modern legend was forged, a legend acknowledged in the weary, respectful tones of their German adversaries. In the brutal final chapters of World War II, as the conflict raged across Europe and Asia, a unique and profound respect began to form between two of the fiercest adversaries, the German soldiers of the Wehrmacht and the legendary Gurkhas. From Nepal, this wasn't a respect born in the quiet of peacetime, but one forged in the heat of battle, a sentiment that echoed through the barbed wire fences of prisoner-of-war camps from late 1944 into early 1945. Imagine the scene. A German soldier, captured and defeated, now sitting in a dusty camp, perhaps in Italy or North Africa. He looks up and sees his guard, a smaller man with a distinctive hat and a curved knife, the infamous Kukri, at his side. This is a Gurkha. Just weeks before, this same German might have been desperately fighting for his life against these very soldiers. The stories that circulated among the German posts were a mix of awe, terror, and surprisingly, gratitude. They spoke of the Gurkhas' almost supernatural stealth in the jungle and their ferocious charges on the battlefield. The war cry, "Eo Gurkhale," the Gurkhas are coming, was enough to send a chill down the spine of even the most battle-hardened veteran. They were described as relentless, appearing from nowhere, fighting with an efficiency that was both terrifying and admirable. One German soldier might recount how his machine gun nest was overrun in a matter of seconds, not by a large force, but by a handful of Gurkhas, moving with deadly precision. He survived, but the memory of their speed and ferocity would stay with him forever. Yet, woven into these tales of battlefield prowess were other, more unexpected accounts. A German officer, captured after a fierce firefight, might tell his fellow prisoners how, after the chaos subsided, it was a Gurkha who approached him, not with malice, but with a water canteen. He'd be offered a drink, a simple act of humanity amidst the carnage. These stories were not isolated incidents. Many German posts shared similar experiences. They spoke of being wounded and left on the battlefield, only to be found by Gurkha patrols. Instead of being finished off, as the grim logic of war might dictate, they were often treated. Gurkhas were seen carrying wounded Germans on their backs, sometimes for miles, to reach an aid station where they could receive medical attention. This dual nature of the Gurkha warrior became a central theme in the POW camps. They were admired for their incredible fighting ability. German officers, in particular who understood military doctrine and discipline, often expressed a professional respect for the Gurkhas' tactics and courage. They recognized that the Gurkhas weren't just wild fighters. They were highly trained, disciplined soldiers who mastered their craft. One high-ranking German commander, after his capture, reportedly told his interrogators that he would have loved to have a few Gurkha battalions under his own command. He saw in them the ideal soldier, fearless in attack, disciplined in defense, and possessing an unshakable resolve. For the average German soldier, the Lanzer, the feeling was often more personal. It was a profound sense of relief at having survived an encounter with them. In the quiet conversations within the camps, one might hear a soldier say something like, "If you see the Gurkhas coming, your day's either over, or you're the luckiest man alive to be taken prisoner by them." This wasn't an exaggeration. To face them in battle was to face a whirlwind of controlled violence. To be captured by them, however, was often to be treated with a surprising degree of honor and compassion. They fought by a code, a warrior-esque ethos, that seemed to separate the act of combat from the treatment of a defeated foe. This chivalry was a source of constant discussion and surprise. The German soldiers were indoctrinated with propaganda that often dehumanized their enemies. Yet, their direct experience with the Gurkhas shattered these preconceived notions. Here were men from a distant land, fighting for the British Empire, who could be utterly lethal one moment and merciful the next. They didn't loot the dead or mistreat prisoners. They followed the rules of war, often to a degree that shamed their European counterparts. A German NCO might recall being disarmed by a Gurkha who simply took his rifle, gestured for him to walk, and then shared a cigarette with him on the long trek to the rear lines. These small acts of kindness left a massive impression. The Kukri itself was a subject of legend. The Germans had heard the stories that the blade could not be sheathed until it had drawn blood. While this was mostly a myth, the Gurkhas' skill with it was very real. Yet, in the POW camps, the Germans saw a different side. They saw Gurkhas using their kukris, not as weapons, but as tools to chop wood, to prepare food, to clear a path. The dreaded weapon of war was also an everyday instrument, and seeing it used this way helped to demystify, and in a way, humanize, the men who carried it. A Gurkha guard might sit quietly, sharpening his kukri, not as a threat, but as a simple, routine task. This calm, composed demeanor off the battlefield was just as impressive to the Germans as their ferocity on it. So, as 1944 turned into 1945, and the end of the war was in sight, the German prisoners had a lot of time to reflect. They shared stories, not just of battles won and lost, but of the character of the men they fought against. And among all the armies they faced the Americans, the British, the Soviets, the stories about the Gurkhas were unique. They were tales of respect for a worthy adversary, of relief for having survived their deadly efficiency, and of a deep abiding admiration for an enemy who fought with the heart of a lion but also showed the compassion of a man. This was the complex legacy of the Gurkhas, as told through the eyes of the very men they defeated, a testament to a code of honor that transcended the hatred and brutality of war. The Second World War had ended. The guns fell silent across Europe, but the stories, the legends, they were just beginning to be told. In the quiet aftermath, amidst the rebuilding and the reconciliation, a remarkable narrative emerged from the very soldiers who had fought against the Allies. When German veterans spoke of their adversaries, one group was consistently mentioned with a unique blend of awe and trepidation. From the deserts of North Africa to the rugged mountains of Italy, German soldiers had faced a dizzying array of Allied forces. They had fought against Americans, British, French, Poles, and many others. Yet, in their memoirs, their letters, and later, in veteran reunions, they reserved a special kind of reverence for the men from Nepal. These were not just another enemy infantry unit. They were a force of nature. One of the most common refrains heard from Wehrmacht, and even Waffen-SS veterans, was a simple, yet powerful statement. The Gurkhas were the finest soldiers in the British Empire. This wasn't a grudging admission. It was a declaration of profound respect, earned through brutal, close-quarters combat. The transformation was absolute. Before the war, Nazi racial ideology had dismissed the Gurkhas, like many non-European peoples, as inferior. They were underestimated, a footnote in the grand German strategic plans. But the battlefield is a harsh and honest teacher, and the lesson it taught the Germans was that courage in fighting prowess know no race. In the Italian campaign, particularly at places like Monte Cassino, the Gurkhas carved out their fearsome reputation. German accounts from that period are filled with tales of silent, almost supernatural advances. They described how Gurkha patrols would slip through their lines at night, unseen and unheard, leaving behind a trail of chilling evidence. The fear wasn't just of a bullet from a rifle, but of the sudden, terrifying glint of a kukri in the dark. One German officer, writing after the war, recalled an encounter near the Gothic line. His unit had set up a heavily fortified machine gun nest that had repelled several British attacks. They felt secure, almost invincible. Then, one night, the Gurkhas came. He wrote, there was no warning, no shouting, no heavy gunfire, just a brief, desperate struggle in the dark. And then, silence. When the sun came up, the position was overrun. My men who survived spoke of them like ghosts, moving with a speed and ferocity we had never seen. They were not men, they were phantoms. This fear was primal. The famous Gurkha battle cry, Eo Gurkhale, or the Gurkhaza, are upon you, became a sound that could shatter the morale of even the most hardened German veterans. It signaled that the fight was about to become intimate, brutal, and very, very personal. It meant the kukri was unsheathed. The German soldiers knew the legend that a kukri, once drawn in battle, must taste blood before being returned to its scabbard. Whether true or not, the psychological impact was immense. It represented a commitment to the fight that was total and terrifying. But alongside this deep-seated fear grew an equally deep respect. The Germans, who prided themselves on their own martial tradition and discipline, recognized the same qualities in the Gurkhas, perhaps even to a higher degree. They saw men who fought with incredible bravery, often against overwhelming odds, and who adhered to a fierce code of honor. Gurkhas were known to treat prisoners fairly, a fact that stood in stark contrast to the brutal realities on many fronts. They were seen as professional warriors, not ideologues. They were fighting for their comrades, for the regiment, and for a sense of duty that transcended politics. At post-war veteran reunions, where old enemies met as old men, the stories would resurface. You could see a German veteran's eyes light up with a strange mix of dread and admiration when the topic turned to the Gurkhas. Ah, the little men, one might say, shaking his head with a wry smile. We feared them more than any other. When we knew the Gurkhas were opposite us, we knew we were in for the fight of our lives. You could not fool them. You could not intimidate them. You could only fight them and hope you survived. Another German memoir from the African campaign noted, of all the soldiers we faced, the Gurkhas were the most professional. They were masters of camouflage and stealth. You would be staring at a patch of desert, convinced it was empty, and suddenly, they would rise from the sand like spirits. To fight them was an honor, a terrifying honor. This sentiment was echoed across theaters of war. From North Africa to Italy, from Burma to Greece, the story was the same. The legacy of the Gurkhas from World War II is unique. While many Allied units were respected for their tenacity or firepower, the Gurkhas elicited something more. They inspired a genuine awe in their enemies. The Germans, who began the war looking down on them through a lens of racial arrogance, ended it looking up to them as the epitome of a warrior. They weren't just feared, they were admired. This incredible journey from racial underestimation to absolute battlefield Respect is a powerful testament to the Gurkha character. It proves that the true measure of a soldier is not his origin or the color of his skin, but his courage, his skill, and his spirit. Among all the infantrymen of the Allied armies, the Gurkhas stood apart. They were the fighters the Germans deeply, profoundly feared, yet also the ones they respected the most. Their legacy is not just written in the history books of the victors, but also etched into the memories and memoirs of those they defeated, a legacy of fear and of ultimate respect. Thank you for watching. If you found this story of courage and respect as fascinating as I did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more incredible stories from history. We'll see you next time.